I want to give you just a very quick rundown of some additional principles from modern philosophy so that we're going to be able to understand and apply the greatest thinkers of the last 500 years to solving the challenges associated with having a unified framework of the world. And unfortunately, almost no one was as destructive for having a unified framework as was Rene Descartes. Cartesian dualism, which is what he calls his theory that mind and matter are irreducibly separate, meaning that there's no domain in which they can make common contact with one another and therefore can be separated analytically. We can study mind without matter and matter without mind. Despite the obvious kind of logical failures of this, obviously, we literally do study matter with mind all of the time. That's all we're doing whenever we study matter. Descartes sort of throws up his hands and gives up, saying that there's no way to have this framework for intelligibility or this connection between mind and reality. And that is a huge problem. And the reason why that's a huge problem is because that is the very purpose of reality theory, is that you're not going to have anything in the way of true meaning or fulfillment unless you've kind of figured out how mind and reality relate to one another and what is our purpose within this world. And Descartes, even though he has these very ingenious proofs of kind of how we can know reality at all, he has this famous cogito ergo sum, he ends up kind of going off the track a little bit with this dualism idea. So then he kind of forces the hand of all of the later philosophers, right? And you know why that is. It's because all of the philosophers that come after Descartes have to work within this mind matter framework or go against it. So he is setting the tone for the rest of philosophy, even to the present day. Is that if you look at kind of academic philosophy in the halls of academia and so forth, they're still very much entrenched in this Cartesian dualism, and specifically siding on the material side. So they're going to say that mind is something irreducibly separate from matter, but it's also something that supervenes on matter, meaning it's not as fundamental, but it's also separate. So obviously, where the goal of reality theory and the CTMU is to have this connected framework, we're not going to be able to think about that through a Cartesian dualist framework. So this is absolutely essential, is that you get this out of your head, is that any duality which you might see between any dualism between mind and matter, or form and instance, and so forth, are actually not dualisms at all. They are self-dualities, meaning that there are two elements of the same set that are defined by their relationship to one another. So you can't, all the more so, it's the furthest away from what Descartes said, is that looking through this framework of what we're going to talk about in a later lecture, syndifionesis, sameness in difference, is that not only can mind and matter be defined in relationship to one another, they are defined by their relationship with one another. This is absolutely essential. The relationship between mind and matter is the essential basis of both of them. And the entire universe, in fact, can be kind of formulated as this self-transducing mind-matter medium that allows us to interact. And nowhere is this more manifest than in perception, because perception is essentially the encoding of external reality in internal reality, and vice versa, the projection of internal reality, which is then made outwards through perception. And you can think about perception in a more general way than just sight or hearing or so forth. You can think about it maybe as like the ability to interact in the world in a way that is iterably stable, meaning that you're getting new information and you're figuring out how to better work. And that's why true perception, true seeing, it has to happen within this ultimate framework whereby you're able to inform and adapt your evolution to that which is the perceptual input that you receive. So that's what arguably one of the greatest philosophers in the modern era, George Berkeley, kind of posited. He says, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. And this is one of the two logical axioms from which the CTMU is induced. The first one is Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, cognition. And the second one is esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived, perception. And together, cognition and perception form a unified cognitive perceptual manifold, which allows the human cognitive perceptual syntax, the rules and structure of our own minds, to make common contact with the mental and perceptual structure of reality. So Berkeley has a kind of early primordial logical model of the CTMU, is that he kind of rejects the dualism of Descartes and says that reality is perceptual in nature. It's an intersect of both mind and matter through this perceptual act. And so that's what we say with respect to how the universe constructs itself with respect to cognition, is that space is infinite with respect to cognition. It's basically if you think of reality stripped of perceptual content, so cognition without perception, it's infinite. There's no binding to it. Whereas it is backwardly finite with respect to perception, meaning that we are actually participating in the finitary aspect of reality. We are collapsing the infinite potential in order to create a causal timeline that then allows for our finite, cognitively bound brain to interact with the universe in an iteratively stable way. And so it is perception that allows us to make free choices and to inform our evolution based on our own self-model. So anything in the way of having a meaningful model of human existence has to think about perception. So again, if you subtract perception from your reality, you don't have anything. Think about what experience would be like without perception. And I'm not talking about people who are blind or deaf or whatnot. That is of course, although terrible, it's something that happens to people. But if there were literally no objective content for your cognition, that is what reality is like without perception. All that remains is pure subjective cognition without any objective content. And further, people try to argue, this is so absurd that people argue against cognition and perception, because cognition, perception, that is, it's like they're literally arguing using cognition against the existence of cognition, subtracting cognition from reality, making a very sophisticated mental argument for that. So that doesn't make sense at all. So that is the trap that David Hume, one of the philosophers in the school known as Empiricism, which has informed the epistemological, meaning the study of knowledge, the foundations of how science thinks about knowledge nowadays. You'll often hear people say empirical science, and that's kind of referring to what David Hume was putting forth with these ideas of empiricism. But actually, David Hume's empiricism is offensive to reason and the very intelligibility of reality that allows us to do science. So let me explain. The Hume entirely gets rid of causation and says it's just our cognition connecting random things. Really, there is no structure, there's no order, there's no patterning to reality. And any attempt to kind of impose our view on reality is that by connecting disparate objects is actually just our own cognition inducing that. And there's this problem, he calls it the problem of induction, which is how do you can have a set of empirical deductions. You can say the sun has risen every day for the last million years, but you don't quite know that it's going to rise the next day. So therefore, science is circular and fundamentally flawed because it entails the prior assumption of that which it seeks to establish. And the Chris Langan actually says the problem of induction is entirely real. But that's only true within the epistemological framework of modern science. So what science is trying to do, it's trying to just attach its theories to its observations like epistemological magic glue. It's just like, oh, put them together and see if it sticks. But that's not actually how theorization works. It actually takes a deeper level, a more general framework for knowledge, for identification, for attribution that has these super tautological aspects that actually says that at the limit of empirical reality, induction and deduction are one and the same. Is that reality is actually inducing itself from axioms, even as it's deducing itself working inward. So what you have to do is you have to mirror the structure of how reality attributes and identifies things to itself in reality theory. Remember, that's one of our axioms. Reality equals reality theory. So anything that reality is doing, we want to do as well. So reality theory, what we have to do is we have to induce a general framework from these, prime aspect of cognition and perception. We have to think about, and then using that general framework that's induced from how perception and cognition work and all the explanatory infrastructure that's needed for the connection between internal and external reality, we then use that to work inwards and develop more specific observations. So the problem with science that Hume was pointing out is that it works outward. It takes the observations and then tries to induce a more general theory. With the CTMU, we get around that because we already have the more general theory. We just have to work inwards and fill in the specific gaps in our knowledge. So that's why no human theory will ever match the CTMU in terms of scope. It's only in resolution that it will. It's only, we can fill in all of the gaps in our knowledge, which are infinite, must necessarily continue to grow. It's not something that will root, bind, and choke the growing knowledge of the world, but actually fertile and well-aerated soil through which it can spread. So the CTMU is a general logical framework for making grounded assumptions, or grounded attributions more accurately, is that in science, as Hume pointed out, it's impossible to do that. So Hume made a very important contribution to reality theory, but then he sidetracked that. And since then, all of science, all of modern philosophy has kind of gone off his tangent as well. But the CTMU restores what, hopefully it was that Hume was originally trying to say, right? So the CTMU, and so that gets to Kant, who asserted that when you have two basically classes of things in reality. You have noumena, which are things in themselves, and then you have phenomena, which are things plus their perceptual content. And so Kant runs into a little bit of a logical impossibility here, however, is because a noumena, a thing in itself, it basically amounts to an inconceivable concept. It means something that cannot even be applied with perceptual and cognitive framework. But we're living in a cognitive and perceptual reality. So that's really not something that's going to fly. The way that again the CTMU reformulates this is that it is to kind of say, yes, there is this in-between space between perceptual content and that which is perceived, in which you do have, yes, this like unprimed cognition that remains even when perceptual content is subtracted. And those are like the kind of, not the essential nature of things, but the stripped nature of things devoid of their content. And yes, there's this kind of in-between space in which they exist, a space of potential, and the CTMU formulates that as being a sort of spirit world, as being a non-terminal domain, a world of design and potential that is constantly acting on and generating new timelines for the possibilities and evolution of reality. So that is essentially what noumenal reality is this programming world, is this spirit world in which reality can then program itself, and then the phenomena, the perceptual content of the objective universe, is the terminal domain. It is the display of that reality simulation, and so to speak. And so Kant leaves an enormous gap between phenomenal and noumenal reality. The CTMU says those are actually elements of the exact same thing. So we'll get into that more when we do our course on Kantian philosophy, because that's a very interesting topic. But and again, Christopher Langan says, whatever Kant had in mind when he induced the concept of a noumenon, we must rely on something other than Kantian metaphysics to find it. So that means that we have to formulate noumena and phenomena as these self-dual elements in order that they can have any causal effect on one another. Again, the CTMU is the final victory over dualism, because it's saying all of these different things: a mind-matter dualism, mind-body dualism, phenomena, noumena, whatever you're going to say, those are elements of the same thing. They make common contact with one another. They are defined by their broader relationship. The mind-matter relationship is more fundamental than either mind or matter. The phenomena, noumena, self-programming, self-transducing is more fundamental than either things in themselves or their perceptual content. You have to understand this, is that reality is monic. It is one relationship. And that means that you're not going to have any of these separations fly in the face of reality theory. It's simply impossible. So the CTMU is a victory over dualism, and it is a model of science. It's how we have to model the world in order to have any intelligibility at all. Thank you.